Where have you eaten bread? So the first picture is of the place where I had communion for the first time because we weren't at the church where I couldn't have it because I wasn't old enough. So we were at my grandmother's church in Texas, and I got to eat communion for the first time. The second picture is Glastonbury Cathedral, Wells Cathedral in England. I was there at Christmas time, and I happened to go to church. I was like 21. I happened to go to church, and this boys' choir was singing. It was the most amazing thing. Can you imagine a boys' choir filling up that space with their song? The most beautiful music you'd ever heard. And I had communion that day. The next picture is of the chapel in Rome where I lived for a year. One of my rooms overlooked that chapel, so I was staring at the cross. I always saw that as looking back on my life, God pointing me in the direction, right? Like, why would you put me in front of the only room that can look out on the chapel and see the cross every day? I used to take communion there because I didn't know that you weren't supposed to. Like, it never said in the bulletins. The priest never said you couldn't have it. I wouldn't dare take communion now because I know too many Catholic friends. But back then, at Loyola, you were welcome to the communion table. You didn't have to be Catholic to take communion. The next picture is of my family church in Connecticut. So there, I wonder what I would say for bread. Is the bread that important there the Sunday meal that my aunt made every week? With bread that came with macaroni and cheese, or the days we really liked when the bread was pizza? Where have you eaten bread? The top picture is Pilgrim Park. And I remember many times sitting around a campfire having crackers, right? Graham crackers, and then putting marshmallows and chocolate on them. But I also remember being young and having odd communions, right? Like fish crackers and grape juice. So the next picture is my son, because I didn't have one of him in the church with my dad. And we were living with my parents while I went to seminary, and so we'd go to church with Dad on Sunday. And Reed's favorite food was bread. Particularly if it was white bread, and I didn't let him eat white bread, right? At my house, he had the good kind of bread. So we would get there, and because I grew up in a time that was different from my experience, and I didn't like the fact that I was excluded as a child, I let my son take communion. And so we're sitting there in communion, the bread comes to him, he takes it, he's holding it, and you know how hard that is when you're little and your favorite thing in the world is bread, and it's a big chunk of white bread, right? And he's holding it. And so when he finally gets to put it in his mouth, because his grandpa has told him it's okay, he goes, "Yum!" And it's a church, right? So it's really loud, and everybody in the entire church can hear him say that. And my dad got in a lot of trouble for that. But for me, it's always reminding me of the essence of why we do communion, right? That when you take this piece of bread, it is supposed to be that piece of bread that says, "Yum." That says, this is filling me up. That this is a taste of heaven. That this is a bite of what connects us all together. And so I always remember that little Reed eating that piece of bread. So the next picture is from the night I first got to officially lead communion, because I was ordained that day, and shared communion with all of my family. The last picture is the last time I shared communion with you all. But where have you eaten bread? How important is it to you? So when we were little, my brother was on the swim team. Well, we both were, but he stuck with it and actually swam for his college swim team and made it to state. But that meant that, so, I know you think I'm tall, but I always felt short because my dad was 6 feet tall and my brother was 6'4". So they were both much taller than me. So during that period from 8th grade until high school, me and my mom would have to go to the Wonder Bread store because it is the 70s and 80s, right? They don't have those anymore. And you didn't have really wheat bread unless your grandmothers were making it for you. So we'd go to the Wonder Bread store and have to fill up the entire cart because when my brother got home from swim practice, he would eat an entire loaf of bread. And he never looked like me. He was always stick thin like my son. So when you see my son, that's what my brother looked like at that age. But bread for him was like this life-giving meal. It was what made him full. Because growing up, we never had a lot of money. With my dad being a pastor and my mom, for the younger years, taking care of us and working part-time, we never had a lot. And how many of you can remember a time when you struggled for food? When I was in college, going to grad school in Connecticut, after I had moved out of my grandmother's house and was living on my own, I was the thinnest I had ever been because I didn't have enough money for food. And do you know how hard it is to ask for help when you're hungry? How hard it is to say to your mom and dad, I've paid all the bills, but there's nothing left for me to eat. How many people today have to make that same conversation? Have to get up the nerve for the first time because they've lost their job or their job doesn't pay enough, and so they've gone to the food pantry to ask for food. To say, I can't take care of myself, I need your help. That's what it feels like. It's hard, it's difficult. And so you would rather starve sometimes than ask somebody to give you food. Where have you eaten bread? When my son was in high school, I took my confirmation class and him along to Milwaukee so that we could experience what it was like in the city and help people, learn what it meant to live with people who were in poverty. And so the first night we went to the Catholic food supper. And so here's the thing, that night when they brought us there, they didn't want us to serve the food. They wanted us to sit at each of the tables and have conversations with the people who were coming for food. They wanted to welcome us in to eat that bread and that soup with those who were hungry, not to be the one serving them, but to be present with them, having conversations with them. And so Reed and I don't eat meat, so we got the plate and it's all stuff we're not going to eat, any of it. So they said one of the things you have to remember when you sit down is people are going to want to trade. So Reed and I were like, here, have whatever you want. Because all we could eat that night was bread. That same weekend, we got up really early at 5 o'clock in the morning because our next task was to feed the men at this homeless, re-emerging community where they were learning the life skills they needed so that they could then go out into the world and have the ability to fund a house for themselves. And so we got up really early making toast and oatmeal and cereal, so that when they got up, there was a buffet of food for them to eat. Where have you eaten bread? When Jesus invites us in the prayer and says, this is how I want you to pray. Give us this day our daily bread. We're to remember the bread, right? All the places that he invited us into bread. The times when he sat down to dinner and broke bread with everyone around him, and the people afterwards or outside the house would snicker and say, you're eating with tax collectors and sinners and prostitutes. How could you? We remember the time when he took a little boy's lunch, a couple of fishes and some bread. And he took that lunch because he had looked out at all the people, the crowd that was huge, and saw that they were hungry and it was too far to go to get food. And so he took that little boy's lunch, he blessed it and he broke it and he shared, and everyone ate until they were full and there was food for tomorrow. We remember the bread. Because after that, he said to his disciples, I am the bread of life. Anyone who eats from me will be full. I am like the bread that Moses got, the manna from heaven, that bread that will be with you daily. The bread of life. And we remember the story of that last night. That night when the disciples were at a table that had been set to celebrate the freedom that they had once had, to celebrate their release from captivity. A time to remember all that they had gone through, all the pain that the people had struggled with, to remember that they, the people, were now in that same place. They may not have been enslaved, but they didn't have control. And at that meal, Jesus took that bread. He took that bread and he broke it and he blessed it and he gave it to them. This is the bread of heaven. This is the bread that will nourish you when I am gone. This is the bread that when you eat it, you will remember everything I taught you. And we remember that after the resurrection, when the disciples didn't know what to do, when they were lost, he appeared to two men on the road and they had a chat. They had a conversation of all that Jesus had done. They had a conversation of what Jesus had come to say, and they didn't recognize who they were talking to until that bread was broken. And then their eyes opened and they recognized the presence of Jesus with them. And the next morning, those disciples were on the beach. They put out to sail hoping to get food. And there was nothing in their nets. But then someone said, "Is that Jesus on the shore?" And Jesus said to them, "Pull in your nets." And their nets were full of food. And when they got back to shore, Jesus broke the bread with them, sharing with them. What are you to do? But he said it this way: do you love me? Feed my sheep. love me? Tend my sheep. Do you love me? Feed my sheep. So when Jesus asks us to pray that line, give us this day our daily bread, what is he asking us for? What is he reminding us of? Now, here's the thing. The commands change at this point. In the prayer, up until then, if you read it on the wall, it's been about God. The prayer has been a call to God, a recognition of who God is, a call for God to come. The next line is about us. Give us this day our daily bread. Jesus is inviting us into the prayer for the thing that we need the most, that we cannot live if we do not have bread. Give us this day our daily bread. And why does he say it like that? Because he wants to remind us of the stories of their people. How when they cried out for bread, God gave them bread. God didn't give them bread, ordinary bread. God gave them manna from heaven that was crisp and tasted like honey. But the thing God did about that manna is he couldn't hoard it. All you could do is eat enough for that day because it would go bad if you tried to store it up. That God wanted to teach us about what is needed and necessary. What is needed for the day is that loaf of bread. What is needed for that day is daily to have that bread. And so Jesus invites us to say those words. Give us this day our daily bread, to remind us that the world is a world of abundance and everyone can be fed. Everyone can be fed if we choose. That there's no need for hunger. And that's why right now, talking to your representatives, although here in California, it doesn't matter. When I was in Illinois, it mattered because my representative was a Republican. So every time I told him that things were a problem, he at least heard one voice that said, when you cut the ag budget and you play games with the WIC funding, there are children who don't have milk and cereal and fruit to eat. And right now, they're arguing over that again. They're arguing over who deserves the money to get fed. And while they agreed for 45 more days, they didn't agree to fund it beyond that. And so those same arguments are going to come out that it's okay not to feed women and children. And during this time of year, most of the hunger organizations have advocacy time for you to advocate for bread for all, bread for the world, to call up your representatives, to send them letters advocating that everyone has enough bread for today. This also comes into play if you think about the Ukrainian war. That one of the problems right at the moment is that when Russia is losing, they stop the ships from sailing, and Ukraine is one of the breadbaskets of the world. And when they can't send their grain shipments out, then people start starving in Africa because there's no food. The UN can't pass out that food to those who need it. So you have a role to play in that, in talking to your representatives about why we have to support Ukraine, because without their bread, the world starves. Without bread, the world starves. Give us this day our daily bread. Jesus invites us to look at the world differently, to live in the world differently, to live in the world knowing that everyone can be full and satisfied. If you ask for what you need, not what you want. If you share what you have, there's enough for everyone. And so that's why in that prayer, he knows that his people have sometimes been hungry. He wants them each day to ask God to give us, not just me, but us, all of us, bread for the day, food to get through. Give us this day our daily bread. As I was preparing this week, Reverend Jackie Lewis, who is the pastor of Middle Collegiate Church, wrote this on her line, on her social media platforms. When I took communion for the first time, my mother handed me bread and said, "This means that God will always love you." Then she handed me juice and told me, "This means God will never leave you." The heart of the gospel. You are beloved and you belong. You are never alone. That when we eat bread, we're to remember it all. We're to remember the stories in our scripture of bread and the provision that bread gives us. We're to remember the stories that when we cry out, God will send a widow with flour and oil to make you bread. We're to remember. We're to remember that bread feeds us not just today, but can feed us every day. And that when we take that bread, we are taking a piece of God's love into us. We remember that we are loved beyond imagining.